and welcome to Always Take Notes.
If you're a budding writer, you'll be excited to hear that this week's sponsors are Curtis Brown Creative, the renowned writing school affiliated to the major literary agency.
Since launching in 2011, over 160 of their students have gone on to get major book deals, including critically acclaimed authors Bonnie Garmus, Jane Harper, and Kirsty Capes.
CBC offers a wide range of online writing courses designed to help you no matter what your current skill level is. For people at the start of their writing journey, they have a 4-week Creative Writing for Beginners course led by author and founder of CBC, Anna Davis. The course will teach you to unleash the potential of your imagination. You'll gain the confidence to put pen to paper and get to work on a story of your own creation.
Plus, all students will be given the opportunity to get individual feedback from one of CBC's expert fiction editors.
Visit www.curtisbrowncreative.co.uk to find out more about all the courses on offer.
Curtis Brown Creative have provided an exclusive discount for Always Take Notes listeners. You can use the code ATN20 for £20 off the full price of Creative Writing for Beginners or any other 4 or 6 week online writing course.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the novelist Marlon James.
We spoke to Marlon about growing up in Jamaica and his decision to leave the country, about winning the Booker Prize for A Brief History of 7 Killings, and about his new African fantasy trilogy.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it. Marlon, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's excellent to have you on the show. We wanted to start with your new novel, Moon Witch Spider King. We're wondering, could you tell us a little bit about how this fits into the larger Dark Star trilogy that you've been working on for the past few years? And I was particularly amused by this comment that you gave in a previous interview that you said that after winning the Booker, you said you were going to geek the fuck out and write an African Game of Thrones. Do you still feel that that's the kind of direction you're working in, or has it evolved since then?
I hope it's evolved since then. It's funny. That whole line took on a life of its own. Poor George Martin, even he called me saying, I heard you write an African version of my book, which is kind of not true. It is true in the sense that, I think the reason why I drew for George's work, is because he didn't think he had to let go of make-believe in order to write about adult things. And I think we have this idea, and it's a very Western, it's a very European idea, that when you put away make-believe, you've grown up. When you put fantasy and so on are childish things, even though we still think there's a certain immaturity to the fantasy fan or the sci-fi fan or to the person who plays video games. We still think that. We still think they need to get alive. When really it's the sort of maturity attributed to the loss of imagination that's made up. So yeah, in a sense, so the comparison fit in the sense that I wanted to write something that I guess some people would still consider literature, but not let go of the mythologies and the stories and the legends and the freaky stuff and the cool shit that I'm still fascinated with and I still love, yet still write a story that deals with very complicated issues. And I think, hopefully that's what I'm still doing.
You've also described the trilogy as kind of one story from 3 perspectives, Rashomon-like. Where did that approach come from?
It came from a bunch of things, including Rashomon, which I had rewatched. And it remains one of my favorite movies. But I've always loved the idea of one story having very different versions. And I think that's because I grew up with those stories. I grew up with my, grandfather telling us a different story every day, and it's only by the 3rd day you realize these are the same characters, but it's a totally different story. And also the notion that there's one way to tell a story is also another thing that's Western, and I've been harping that already in this interview quite a bit, but there was a lot of unlearning of storytelling that I had to do in order to tell this kind of story. And one being that the burden of truth on a story is on the story. It's with these stories, certainly with the African legends that I've been reading, the burden of truth is on you. You have to decide whether it's true or not. When I wrote Black Leopard, Red Wolf, I believed that protagonist. When I wrote Moon Witch Spider King, I believed her. And I think that's, that type of storytelling, which is a very ancient way of telling a story. There's something about it that really struck me. Something about it that struck me as a wonderful way of telling a story. Something about it struck me that I could tell 4, 5, 6 different versions of this story, and they'd be totally different stories, because we're doing it all the time. We're seeing it now, where people are looking at the same facts and coming to different ideas about what they are. And the idea of different people telling the same story and the reader having to decide who's telling the truth was something that was very appealing to me.
What was your process in terms of researching African mythology when you were beginning to work on these books? Were there particular sources that you had, or how did you go about exploring that world?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the research led to the story. The story didn't lead to the research. I started researching African myths, legends, histories because I didn't know them. And because at some point I started to realize what it must feel like when you can take your mythologies for granted, which I think a lot of people of European descent do. You don't have to sit down thinking about King Arthur all day. But he is, and it's a fundamental aspect of Britishness, the myth of Camelot. I don't know, or at the time I didn't know what it was like to have that foundational myths. Margaret Atwood said human nature hasn't changed in 1,000 years, and the way you know is to check the mythologies. I didn't have mythologies to check. So it was going back and looking at these stories that a novel emerged. It wasn't the other way around, where I had this idea for a cool African novel and look for research. And these stories just start to write themselves. I don't know who said it, so I'm going to take credit for it, that you don't create stories, you find them. That was what I did. I found all these stories. I didn't hijack them wholesale. Of course, I did my own things with them, and reading. The great thing about reading mythologies is that you start to create your own myths as well. Certainly your own make-believe. And that's how it happened, that the stuff I was reading made me more and more convinced there was a novel here, as opposed to I had this novel idea, so let's find some stuff. Of course, once I realized I had a novel, then I had to do even more research. And I'm primarily known as a historical novelist, which I've always not really, I don't take offense to it, but I'm kind of taken aback that a period that I actually lived through is considered historical. I'm not that old. But the thing about being a historical novelist is that research is a major part of your job. Because while it's history for me, it's not history for the characters. And you have to move through the past, or move through a sci-fi world, or move through something completely make-believe, as if the characters think it's real. Which means it's not just a matter of researching stuff that happened. I have to research how people lived in it. I have to research the boring stuff. When I was reading a novel on slavery, I was reading tax records. The boring geeky stuff that because I know all of this, the characters can move through the world as if they've always lived there, which is a very long way of explaining your research question.
We love the boring geeky stuff on this podcast. I was actually about to follow it up with another one. How do you organize your research? We've had all sorts of methods on this podcast, including binders and color-coded things. Do you have a system to keep it all to hand?
Man, if I had a system, I'd write faster. I have just notebooks upon notebooks upon notebooks, and then I have a research assistant, and he has notebooks upon notebooks. I don't think I have a system. Or this is what happens. I realize I need a system midway through writing something, and then call my assistant, terrified and paranoid. Can you put all of this in one thing? And of course, he does it. My assistant Jeff, he's fantastic with that. But I don't start off grab research on women's headgear of the Middle Ages, but I need it. I go, hey, can we see how much stuff have we done on headgear, and put it together? Because I think I'm very scared of missing something if I get very specific with how I do research. So I read everything, including, as you said before, the boring stuff. And I've read so much and annotated so much and make notes of so much that no, I mean, I can literally like just go through my research as if somebody would go through Wikipedia or Google, and use it in that way. For me, it's constantly building this reservoir of imagination that I can always tap into, as opposed to anything specific.
We want to come back to the new novel later in the conversation, but could we roll back now to the start of your career and to your childhood, really? And is it true that you had quite a difficult time growing up in Jamaica, particularly spent a lot of time on your own and quite engaged with comics, and that school was quite complex for you as well?
I mean, yeah, I'm just not sure it was not particularly that remarkable. I mean, I was a nerd. As an 80s nerd who listened to Prince and read comics. And at a part of a school that had the same old hierarchy of jocks, geeks, nerds, freaks, and so on. And yeah, I ended up spending a lot of time on my own, like a lot of writers, and a lot of time reading, tons of books, but mostly comics, and just disappearing into that fantasy world. And by fantasy, I don't mean dragons and witches, but just the world of make-believe, the world of superheroes. Because the thing I realized, and I wouldn't have said it back then because I wouldn't have the words to say it, but I read, for the main reason I read was because I wanted to have more than one life. Yeah, certainly one other than the one that I was presently living, and that's where that came from.
Do you think reading comic books voraciously in your formative years shaped your understanding of narrative in any particular way?
Yeah, I think certainly the comic books I was reading, which is mostly X-Men and Teen Titans and so on, is that they did help sharpen my idea of human nature. People doing things they don't want to do, or people doing things that they have to do, or what exactly does evil mean? For something that was kid stuff, they were incredibly complicated stories. But they also, I think, particularly a comic like X-Men, is they never shy away from the freakish nature of the characters. That these weren't the Avengers who were celebrated and beautified and pretty and everybody loves them and they were the popular kids. These are the, again, like me, they were the nerds, they were the geeks, they were the not pretty kids, they were the outcasts. And to remember the humanity of those characters, even as people around them continually dehumanize them, I thought was a pretty powerful lesson, which I wouldn't have said back then because I wouldn't have noticed that I was learning it. But I see that now.
Do you have memories of 1976 and the Bob Marley assassination attempt that later found its way into A Brief History of Seven Killings?
In a weird, yes and no. I mean, I was 6. In fact, I was 6. I was barely 6 for a month, but I grew up in a house with a detective and with a lawyer, and they never shied away from talking in front of their children. And what I remember, the thing that haunts me about it was how they talked about it. My mom, being a cop, she can talk about crime in a very detached way, in a way in which most people don't. This was the first time she wasn't detached. The first time, I could pick up something else there, even if I didn't know what the words were. I could pick up some sort of fear, nervousness, because Bob Marley was untouchable. Yeah, that was the unwritten rule in Jamaica. Nobody touches a tough gun. And I think the fear that they were transmitting was that if we're in a stage now where people go after Bob Marley, they'll go after anybody. And that I understood. Even at 6 years old, I understood things was different.
To jump ahead again slightly, what made you want to pursue literature at university?
Well, actually, one, because I couldn't get into mass communications. I failed the entrance exam. So I didn't head to college with sort of some drive. I'm going to do literature. I gave it because I wasn't good enough to get into the communications class, and I had to pick something. And, I remembered how much I love books. So to spend some time with books, particularly with the degree I did where I minored in politics. So that rounded it out. But it was, I'd love to say I was like diehard in my pursuit of literature. When I came to college, I was frustrated that I wasn't pursuing art, because that was my first love and that's what I wanted to do. But I think I drank the Kool-Aid that an artist in Jamaica was going to be starving and suffering, and I didn't want to be poor. So I went to college to do this communications degree, because that was a sexy degree, but I wasn't smart enough to pass the test. So I ended up doing English. So it really was by default, honestly. It certainly wasn't by design.
And through this period when you were at school and university and then working in advertising, how big a factor was homophobia that you had to contend with, and how big a factor was that in your decision to eventually leave Jamaica?
I think it's big in the sense that it colors everything I did. It colored, rather, everything I did. How I spoke, how I behaved. At one point, I was even measuring how many words I'd say in a sentence, because if I said too much, I'd start to sound gay. So it really affected me on a macro level. I don't think it didn't affect me on a major level. It's not like I was a victim of a homophobic attack. Usually people think when they hear I come from Jamaica, they think some anti-gay Gestapo was hunting me down or something. And it was way more subtle than that. It was way more, and because it was more subtle, it was more endemic, and it was more for me damaging. I think it would have been in some ways easier to just deal with a mob, because that's simple and that's actual people. You can externalize it. Instead, I internalized it, and I think in some ways that was worse. But because I was responding to a threat that never really manifested itself. I can't say it did. I mean, I'd be lying if I said I've ever encountered homophobia in Jamaica. I really haven't. I mean, I could say high school, but I mean, that almost doesn't count. That just makes me, a plot of an 80s sitcom, really. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter if I didn't need a mob outside to fear what would happen to me. I didn't need the threat of violence to fear violence. And I certainly didn't need people to tell me I was different to fear being different. And I think, that is certainly one of the reasons why I left Jamaica. Certainly not the main reason, honestly. Because, I mean, when you are, people rarely talk about the gay person who stays in Jamaica. Everybody talks about the ones who leave, and I was one who left. But, nobody talks about the one who stays. And the person who stays find a way to come to terms with the country you're living and live some sort of life that a lot of them find even happy. It wasn't enough for me. It's not that I don't think I wanted to be closeted, for example. I don't know if I wanted to be in a situation where I had to be always monitoring my actions. I don't want to be being caught holding somebody's shoulder too long or so on. And I'm not, as I said, I've never suffered the consequences of any actions, but again, you don't need to suffer the consequences of something to fear it. And that's one of the things that pushed me out. But honestly, I was equally pushed by the idea that I don't think I could be an author and live in Jamaica. I think hopefully my generation is the last of the kind that felt they had to migrate to make a career. That was just because, yes, I wanted to live my life as I wanted, but I also wanted to write books. And that to me, that's how I came to define myself. And not finding community, at least not the community that I wanted, not finding resources, not even finding somewhere I could do a terminal degree, not even being able to do an MFA, not finding the kind of life that would support my art or the type of career that would support my art. I mean, all these things played into it.
What were the steps then that led you to the publication of your first novel, John Crow's Devil, in 2005? Well,
I mean, I wrote that novel mainly to prove that I could write a novel. It's funny enough, this story involves Sinead O'Connor. I don't know her. But people used to make all her story, not her stories, all the press about her would talk about how she's making all these songs from trauma. You know, her diary, her life is so personal, her heartache. And I remember thinking, man, if Sinead ever have a happy year, what's going to happen to her music?
Which is what people say about Adele.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, surely I'm not going to be miserable my entire life. What's going to happen when I'm finally happy? Am I going to suck? Because I used to read these sort of semi-autobiographical things or these thinly disguised fictions, which I really hope never gets published. At least wait till I die. And so I wrote this novel because I wanted to write something that had absolutely nothing to do with me whatsoever. Of course, 20 years later, I realized it totally is about me. But I wanted to write something removed from me. Just write set in the 50s. It's set around people I've never met and would never be friends with. I was really, really deep in church at the time, which is a whole other story. And I wrote about a really, really dysfunctional church that's basically a cult. And primarily as an exercise to prove to myself I could write something that wasn't about me. The idea that I could publish it didn't come till a year later. And, you know, I think a lot of people know the story by now. You know, deciding you want to publish something and publishing it is a whole different thing. And of course, when I wrote it, nobody wanted it. When I decided I wanted to publish it, absolutely nobody wanted to publish it. You know, I went through dozens and dozens and dozens of publishers and editors and agents, and nobody really wanted it.
I was reading about this, and I saw that you'd experienced over 70 rejections with John Crow's Devil, and then the Book of Night Women was also turned down almost 20 times before Riverhead picked it up. I mean, in that situation, how did you keep going? What was your motivation?
Man, I wish I could say I did keep going. I actually didn't. I actually did not. I didn't keep going. I remember, funny enough, rejection number 78. For John Crow's Devil, because I didn't know it was number 78. This is a problem, you know. I would like send out 6 letters and wait like 6 weeks, 6 weeks, a month, 8 weeks, whatever. And if I didn't hear from anybody or if they said no, I just printed out another 6. And I kept doing that for around a year and a half, I think. Not really paying attention because I had other things doing. I'm like, okay, didn't hear from them. It's the same damn letter, just put different address and send out. And when I got this card from a publisher who should remain nameless, meaning Soho Press, and it was just, the card just said, "Not for us," which I thought was really rude. But it was the first time I stopped and I went, hold on, how many of these have I gotten? And that's when I finally counted it, and it came up to 78. And I have no memory of what else I did that day because I was just so shocked and stunned. I have no memory of what else happened that day. I don't know if I had known all along I'd have persevered to 78. I don't think I would. But I'm not sure being hit in the face with that revelation felt any better. Either way, I gave up. I said, nah, if you know, these people aren't idiots. These people are some of the smartest people in their field. If 78 people think this is not good enough, it can't possibly be good. So I gave up. I threw the book away. Actually, I burned it. I did a whole ritual burning. It was great. It was very cathartic. And I erased it from my computer. And I remember going to because I didn't have a printer, so I'd always print out files at my friends' houses, and I'd go to their houses and go on their computers and find the file and delete it there.
And then it was Kaylee Jones, right, who sort of pushed on.
Yeah, Kaylee Jones came for a workshop, and Kaylee Jones was a last minute replacement. This is why I'm terrible on Careers Day, because people go, "What do you do?" I go, "I don't know. Get lucky and have dumb shit happen to you." I'm horrible with Careers Day. Anyway, yeah. So she, I was in a workshop which I only went to because I felt duty bound to do it, and she saw that I could write, and she made it clear she was not going to leave the country until I found a copy of the manuscript and give to her. And someone managed to find it in an outbox of an old computer. And gave it to her, and she edited it for free. That's how she loved it. And she found a publisher, which was her publisher at the time, an independent publisher, Akashic Books, and they published it. And I would say that was that, and that was the start of a great future, except the second book was rejected by a New Liver publisher too. It wasn't just like smooth sailing after. I just realized, the publishing industry, they've come a long way, but they certainly, when I started writing, had a very narrow idea of what kind of books get published, and they had an even narrower idea of what kind of books get published by Black people or people of color or anybody that wasn't white, and usually, male or female. But they had a very narrow idea of the stories that could be told, and I just didn't fit into their idea.
So when you were getting those rejections, if it's not too grim to linger on this for a little longer.
Okay, it's not grim at all.
Did you get any meaningful feedback, or was it more along the lines of this is just not for us?
No, I did. And for people like, upcoming, writers or beginning writers or anybody who wants to write, I would say one of the best gifts you could ever get is the rejecter who tells you why. More often than not, they don't. And a lot of times, when the person takes the time to tell you why they're turning you down, that doesn't mean necessarily want to see it again. And you don't need that either. But it's the feedback they give can be really instrumental. And I remember that. So I remember the agent who rejected Book of Night Woman because he didn't like he didn't feel for any of the characters. And I remember because he gave really, really good instructions, but he was such an asshole about it. And I had to remember thinking, all right, just put your feelings to the side and ignore the manner in which he's speaking to you, and just take the instruction. And I did. So I did take his advice, and I rewrote the novel almost to a T, to suggestions that he made, and then I sent it to a different agent because fuck him. And she managed to get it published through Riverhead, who remains my publisher. So yeah, there's something to be said for the person who turns you down, who tells you why, even if they're not very nice about it.
Hello, it's Artemis, the producer of Always Take Notes. I hope you're enjoying Simon and Rachel's conversation with the novelist Marlon James. It's time for the next instalment of our segment where we share bonus material from previous guests of the show. So this week we're going to hear from the novelist Elif Shafak. And I wanted to share this week because we were actually recently nominated for an award for this episode that we did with Elif. It was for the International Women's Podcast Awards, and it was for the category of Moment of Insight from a Role Model. So thanks so much to the International Women's Podcast Awards for the nomination. And here's Elif Shafak on the most important trait a writer should have.
Two things, not one thing, but I believe a good novelist, a good writer, should be a good reader, a curious reader, an avid reader, maybe a greedy reader, always curious. And I think we should read everything and anything, whatever speaks to us. So I've never believed in that distinction between highbrow literature and lowbrow literature. I don't even know what that means, who makes those distinctions. We can read in everything, like from political philosophy to cookbooks to graphic novels, comic books. If it speaks to you, it's the right book. But just to make the act of reading constant, continuous in our lives, I think is very important. And the second thing I would say, to me it's an important trait, I try to listen to people a lot. And I think I listen to two things, not only what people are telling me or telling each other, but also with what kind of energy, what kind of choice of words, what kind of emotions go into those words, or sometimes silences. So I think we need to be good listeners and good readers if we want to be good writers.
That was Elif Shafak, and if you were interested in what Elif had to say, you can listen to our full episode with her via our website, which is www.alwaystakenotes.com. Now back to Simon and Rachel's conversation with Marlon James.
Could you tell us where teaching has fitted into your kind of journey here? Is it right that you arrived at Macalester in 2007 and you've sort of been there since? And then what have you kind of drawn out of that experience? And then, as you know, your profile now is hugely higher than it was when you arrived. How does it fit in your life now compared to when you began?
Well, I mean, I went back to school in order to teach because I wanted a career that support is not the word I'm looking for, but let's use it for now. That supported my writing and vice versa. And I think that teaching, when you're teaching writing or teaching anything, when you are helping people to do the thing you do, it actually helps you as well. And I teach undergrads, so I get them pretty young. A lot of times they don't even know if they want to be a writer as much as what they want to write. And there's something to be said for being around people who are creative just for creativity's sake, or people who still have this sense of potential. Because I think by the time a writer gets to an MFA program, they're pretty set in what they want to do. And that can be great, but it can also be kind of sorrow. You mean sorrow? I was trying to say sad and narrow, I end up saying sorrow. That should be a word. It can be, it's there. Sometimes you get the sense that they're already too far gone. And with undergrads, the sense of possibility is always there. And I try to still have that in what I write. Even though I take lots of notes, we're talking about all the notes and research that I do. I'm actually pretty open-ended when I write a book. I have no idea where they're going to go. I mean, I might have a slight clue, but I really don't. And I have yet to write a novel that ends the way I thought it would have when I started out. And I think that sense of open-endedness comes from being around these kids. And they teach me all sorts of things, and because they're dealing with some, they're even in their academic life, they're dealing with wider subjects than writing. They're dealing with wider subjects than writing fiction. Whereas when you get to a senior level, MFA level, that's all they're doing. So yeah, they because of them, I still read widely and I write widely and I read everything, and I never developed that literary snobbery, which I thought was going to happen to me at some point, because they're always encouraging me to read stuff that other people think they're too big to read. Chances are, if there's an exciting new poet, I'm going to learn from them first. I'm not going to learn from the institution of literature, who's the most exciting poet out there. I'm going to learn from my students. Certainly interesting hip-hop, I'm going to learn from them. I still think that the most exciting art starts from the ground and comes up, as opposed to starts from the establishment and filters down. And they have their ears to the street. So being around them, I learn things and I pick up things, and it all comes out in the literature that I write in one way or another.
You said that in 2007 it sort of supported your writing, although you queried the use of that word. Was that also in a financial sense? It gave you a kind of bedrock of stability to pursue your writing projects.
Yeah, it did, and I mean, I've had jobs that didn't do that, because it's being creative or teaching creativity or just teaching a love of the books, as somebody who writes them. In some ways, it's its own reward, but. Yeah, being able to have summers off help as well. Being always talking about the stuff that is my life is great as well. I didn't have to switch off one part of me to turn on another part of me to do these things, which was honestly brand new for me.
When A Brief History of Seven Killings won the Booker in 2015, how did that change things for you in your professional life and how things fitted together? And as Rachel alluded to in the last question, we always ask about money on the podcast and how it fits with people's writing lives. So on that side, be as candid or as guarded as you're comfortable being. But how, when you got that prize, did your life change?
Oh, of course, it totally changed. I never shy about talking about money. I have no problem talking about money. I remember being on stage and somebody shouted, "How does it feel to get tainted money from the Booker Prize?" And I'm like, "You're damn right, it tainted. It tainted enough." It's like, I want more. It's like, it's because it's so rare in this field that you get to a point where it can sustain you. It's so rare, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing when it doesn't happen. I mean, whatever. So I'm never going to begrudge somebody that. And as for the book, it's not that the Booker is that much money, but it was transformative. It was transformative in lots of ways. The thing is, a novel that wins the Booker becomes a news story instantly in 48 countries or whatever the countries are in the Commonwealth. I have very mixed feelings about the very idea of the Commonwealth, but I can't deny that something like a Booker Prize makes you a person of interest in dozens of countries. And, I get to visit several countries. I get to see several people. When different people from different nations tell you about how the book will transform them, it is humbling and it's surreal. And you're like, how the hell did this happen? I toured all over the world and I met all sorts of people, and not all of them in the Commonwealth, by the way. It was a major thing for me to go to Brazil, because in a lot of ways, Brazil's urban cultures are very much like Jamaica's. And to see how different cultures and different people, particularly different people of color in the diaspora, respond to this story would not happen without the Booker, honestly. So yeah, it opened a lot of doors which hopefully haven't closed, and it wouldn't have been open. It wouldn't have been open otherwise.
Could you tell us a little bit about the sort of history of the film and TV rights of A Brief History of Seven Killings? What's kind of gone on there?
Well, it's a complex story. It's a complicated story, and I think a lot of people have their idea of how to tell it. I mean, it went through HBO at a time. Funny enough, I'm actually doing a show with HBO now. But at the time, I think there was a combination of, people not quite sure where to go with the story, and a lot of people involved, left and so on. There was a high turnover at the time. So sometimes it's just Hollywood business that gets in the way. Other times it can be a very big misunderstanding of what the novel is, which is what happened the second itineration of this novel, where, I think different people respond to the challenges of the novel in different ways. And one of the challenges of the novel, for example, is language. What are you going to do with all that patois? And people have different ideas, most of them terrible. Sometimes it's let's put subtitles. Sometimes it's let's come up with a hybrid that nobody talks, how nobody sounds, and you end up sounding like that show Luke Cage. Or anytime Whoopi Goldberg plays somebody from the Caribbean. So it went through, it went through a series of different cable houses. Right now we're hopefully about to do something with Netflix. I mean, there's nothing definite yet, so I can't say anything. It's ironic for me because almost all my novels have gone through the Hollywood ringer. And the one that's actually being filmed now is not a novel, it's an original story.
Could we talk a little bit now more about your process of constructing plot? You touched on this earlier, and I was kind of fascinated by this idea that your novels don't go in the ways you premeditate them. And this is a really long-running kind of point of discussion on the show. So with all the novelists that we've had on, we ask them in the kind of language that we've fallen upon, whether they're a plotter or a plunger. So whether they're someone who has a narrative up in, whether it's on cards on their wall or whatever, or whether they're just following their subconscious. And we've heard kind of completely different variations on that, but I was fascinated to read that with A Brief History of Seven Killings, that was originally going to be a crime novel set in New York and Chicago in 1985. And I also came across this line that you gave in an interview saying that Carlos Fuentes says there's no greater tragedy than a book ending exactly the way you planned it. And I think if that happens, maybe the writer's having too firm a grip on the story. Could you unpack a bit for us your kind of process and then maybe your thoughts about plotting versus plunging?
The thing is, I actually do both. I plot and I plunge. I've books after books and notes after notes of plot. I do have the post-it sticked on all over my walls, and I do, try to map out a story right to its very destination. Then I start writing and just dump all that shit. Because it's at some point for me in a novel, characters become people, and people do things you don't expect them to do, and they're volatile, especially if they're my characters. They don't really listen. They make bad decisions, and they surprise and they disappoint. And I think those are all things you can't necessarily plot. You can't plot a surprise, and it's not a surprise. So I was going to say you can't plot disappointment either, because in its way it's a surprise. So it's a combination of both, where I'll have a stack of notes. I think I've been trying to figure out why I plot so much then never use what I plot. And I think one is to clear my head. I think that the more stuff I have down on a page instead of in my head is the less stuff that I have wrestling with or trying to make sense of. But every now and then I will check those notes to stay on track, because it's easy to ramble on and on and on. And I, especially with the type of novels that I'm writing and the type of risks I'm taking, one of them being having dozens of characters, that there still has to be some sort of architecture. There has to be some sort of engine pushing stuff. Or for me at least, it can become just one bloody mess, because I have so many people that I'm writing about. So I do have to bring structure in it. But when I'm with characters, I have to still give them the leeway to go where I didn't expect them to go. And now, to me, that's a highlight of writing. It's when at the end of a writing day, I can say, damn, I never saw that coming.
Violence as well as part of your work. And how do you go about writing those scenes? Do you find it challenging? Is there a particular sort of theory of writing violence that you have?
Not really. I don't know if I think if I have a theory of violence, is that violence should be violent. That violence is an aberration. And it's funny. I did a show with a Canadian. I think it was a Canadian broadcaster, and he was asking me telling me how disturbed he was by the violence in the book. And I don't know if I was just annoyed by being constantly asked a question. And I was like, but you're not disturbed by violence at all. You quite love violence. You just like it your way. It's the person who watches John Wick or watches any type of show where the hero has killed 50, 60, 70, 80 people, but goes off in the sunset with his girlfriend, and you don't think once about the dozens of families that guy just destroyed, then you also have a pretty perverse view of violence yourself. That you can easily set aside so much violence, carnage, and suffering because we need to hear the latest song from whoever is in the soundtrack, and we need our sexy hero and heroine to go off. Yeah, that's a pretty perverse view of violence too, and it's also quite disturbing. So it's always interesting to me when people who are really into a very profoundly disturbing view of violence call my violence disturbing. And I know if we're going to do that, then it's all disturbing. I think the difference with me and say movies like that is that I don't just write about violence, I write about suffering. And I don't just write about violence, I write about consequences. And also, violence is ugly. One of the things that Hollywood has conditioned us to love, and I love it as much as everybody else, is operatic violence or choreographed violence. As if there's nothing choreographed about violence. One of the tropes in Hollywood, and I know this because I'm writing a TV show where a lot of crime happens, and I always ask, so what violence do you want me to write here? Do you want me to write real violence or Hollywood violence? I can give whichever one you want. Because in Hollywood violence, you get shot in the leg and you go, oh, it's a flesh wound. let's continue the fight. In the real world, you get shot in the leg, you're dying. Because 9 times out of 10, you've hit the femoral artery. You're not going to survive the next 15 minutes. From that, you get shot in the belly, your belly will be left crack open for a year. You don't walk off into the sunset with that. And I am very much interested, if I'm going to write those things, to put that in there. So funny enough, I don't think I read a lot of violence. But I do think that the stuff I write reverberates and it resonates and it leaves an echo. And it's disturbing. Because violence is disturbing. There's nothing normal about it. It's actually, this is not how people behave. This is not what normal people don't wake up and think, who I'm going to kill today and do it. It's not normal behavior, and it shouldn't feel easy to digest when you read it.
Could you tell us about sort of post Brief History and post Booker Prize, how you kind of moved to beginning the trilogy? And I was interested to read that you told your agent you had this idea for a kind of quiet, reserved literary novel about Jamaicans in New York, and then took this completely different tack. I mean, was it, following up a huge professional success like that, what was that experience like emotionally and in terms of deciding which way to go?
It was a decision, or rather, it was a choice between the book I thought I should write and the book I wanted to write. Because I think after you win a prize, certainly a prize like the Booker Prize, everybody expects a sort of the mature return, or the quiet novel, or more of the same, or certainly not far removed from the one you just wrote. And I could do all those things, and not cynically, because I think those are all I've seen. Those can be wonderful novels. Those can be fantastic novels. But I knew I was writing it because I was writing a novel I thought I should write. And, William Burroughs talks about how there's no such thing as should in literature. You never do something because you felt you should in literature. You're already gone if you feel that way. And the fantasy stuff was just in the wild dream in the back of my head that I know I really, really wanted to do, but wasn't sure if I could. And, after a while, including talking to my agent, I was like, yeah. And he said, well, that New York one sounds like a wise novel that you would probably do well. And I'm like, yeah, but, I don't wake up in the morning thinking about it. And I think you should lose sleep over a novel. I think you should lose sleep over your ideas. I think you're, as a writer, your subject matter should unnerve you a little bit. You should have really ambivalent feelings about what you're writing. I'm a big believer of that. You should have complicated feelings about what you're writing. And I found myself drawn more to that messy thing that I still deep down always wanted to do. It was almost id versus superego. And id wanted to write about magic. And superego is like, well, be a practical novelist. And I nothing about my life as a writer sounds practical. Nothing about it to me makes any sense, honestly. So the idea that I'm going to make a sensible decision to write with the book I'm writing just seemed kind of stupid.
We're coming towards the end of our time, so I wanted to ask about Get Millie Black, the TV series that you're writing with HBO and Channel 4 in the UK. Where did that idea come from, and how do you decide that a television series was the best way to tell that story rather than a novel?
So this again proves why I'm so terrible at careers day, because I wrote that idea to get rid of the producer, not to do a show. Because this my friend Leopold, who was a producer at the time, kept hounding me for an idea. And was like, I won't leave until you give me a treatment. And I was like, fine, I'll write a treatment. And I go, what is the type of story that would absolutely never get done? Let's see. Let's make her black. Let's make her Jamaican. Let's make everybody Jamaican. Let's have them speaking patois. Let it be a very dark story and blah, blah, blah. And I wrote this thing. I'm like, I made it as unfilmable as I possibly could, thinking I'd never hear from anybody again. And they're like, wow, we love it. And I was like, oh, shit. So now I had to make this show. But, in actually going beyond what I had written to basically get rid of people and to start think about these characters, I kind of fell in love with them. And I fell in love with the story, largely because Millie is a person in flux, and I know a lot about what that's all about. She is, she's a British Jamaican immigrant who becomes a cop in the UK at a time when tensions between immigrant and Black and Caribbean communities and the UK police couldn't have been worse. And she becomes a cop anyway, which is its own issue. And then she ends up in a controversy where she becomes a scapegoat, of course, of no surprise to the immigrant community. And she ends up, being kind of banished back to Jamaica, where she's made a life for herself. But then a case comes along that pulls her right back into the UK. And her dealing with, she doesn't get to the UK till near the end of the season. But it's her dealing with, being Jamaican but never quite belonging in Jamaica, and being British but never quite belonging in Britain, and dealing with a case that just sparks a lot of memories for her. She's looking for a missing person, and the missing person takes her through a human trafficking ring. And then she ends up back in UK, which of course is a huge haven for human trafficking. And she has to face things that she has never had to face before, and a lot of things that she thought was already behind her.
As Rachel said, we're coming up against our time limit, so a final question from me. I was wondering, with the recent trilogy you've been working on that's set in Africa, and with the previous books with Jamaican settings, have you been able to develop a sizable African readership and a readership in Jamaica as well? Because I think we had Aminata Fauna on, who set novels set in Sierra Leone, and said she had faced challenges with lack of book selling infrastructure, with relatively low levels of literacy and things like that. And I was reading some comment online saying that particularly the kind of book selling infrastructure in Jamaica there's been moves away from books towards electronics and stuff like that. How has that whole piece worked for you?
It's a continuing challenge. I'm in Jamaica, and I was talking to somebody yesterday who said that. It's like, I wish your books were available here. I think they are. I think they might just sell out faster than they could provide, which that's my hopeful thought anyway. But it is a problem. I know in Nigeria there's a Nigerian publisher, and in Ghana there are bookstores. But there are other things. One, there's no offer to translate the book into Yoruba. It's one thing to have the book available. It's another thing. I mean, the book's in Croatian. Yeah, it's in Spanish and Catalan. But it's not in Yoruba, it's not in Swahili, it's not in Fan, it's not in Fulani. And because the infrastructures aren't there, which is my way of saying the money isn't there, to do that. So we still have a long way to go. In terms of just the book itself, it's as wide as it can be in those countries, because I've been to the festivals there, whether in person or online. And it's very important to me, and it's great. It's always great hearing from African fans, and African readers rather, more than anybody else, because I'm still I won't lie, I kind of want the approval. I kind of want to know somebody from the motherland thinks, I like this, even if it doesn't necessarily sound African. I mean, I write for myself. I like to, at least that's what I tell myself. But this was an attempt to reconnect with the mythological history I thought I didn't have. So it has a special resonance to do, say, an African book festival, or to talk to Nigerians about the book, or so on. So it's something that I'm not the first writer in the diaspora to face, but I do think it should be one of those sort of 2020s literature problems that we should fix, which is, how do we get the people we're writing about to read our books? And how do we get the people who are a huge part of where we come from, and a huge part of our culture, and a huge part of our legacy, to be a part in this conversation about books that could not have happened without them? And I think those are important things to consider, and those are things that we should work on, and things we should, be more busy about in the coming years.
Well, that's a poignant note to end on. Thank you very much for speaking to us, Marlon, and good luck with the rest of the trilogy, the TV series, the teaching, and everything else.
Thank you so much.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Marlon James. He's on Twitter at MarlonJames5. He has a website, which is marlonjameswriter.com. His latest book, Moonwitch Spider King, is published by Hamish Hamilton. We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pictures.
If you pledge $10 a month, you also get a free 2-month trial to Otter, worth $26, alongside the other rewards. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help when organising interview material.
Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes.
Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Marlon?
I was trying to think how many Booker Prize winners we've had on Always Take Notes now, and I think it's 3. We've had him and Howard Jacobson and Anne Enright. So delighted to be building up this kind of canon. And as with those others, it's just fascinating to ask what the experience of winning the biggest prize in fiction in the UK at least is like, and then particularly how do you follow it up? I thought that was a very interesting question with him and his decision to go off in a radically different direction. Rachel, what about you? What did you think?
I enjoyed his quip as well about the Booker Prize money not being enough. I thought he was a very witty guest. It was interesting too to hear about how he'd responded to failure at the beginning of his career, the 70-odd rejections that he got from publishers. So showed some real tenacity and resilience to persist with writing after all that. Anyway, Simon, what have you been up to?
I have some pleasing news in that my new book has been bought by a publisher in the United States, by Grove Atlantic. So I'll be working on that for HarperCollins here and for them over there. So good that has come together, but it has meant that I'm now been sort of spinning my wheels, doing lots of planning and working things out. Rachel, what about you?
It's very exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What have I been up to? Well, the passing of the Queen plus the retirement of Roger Federer has kept me busy, actually, recently. So I've been doing various pieces about them and popular culture. So I'm looking forward to a holiday soon where I will do lots of reading and put my feet up a bit.
Sounds very good. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there and Always Take Notes. If you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.